Good artist, but for the rest he had, problems like the rest of us. I mean, that's why he loved wretched people who owned big nightclubs. He loved those entrances.
Andy Warhol looks a scream, hang him on my wall. Andy Warhol, silver screen, can't tell them apart at all.
He was the ultimate social climber, as I said before, but his social climbing was more towards celebrityhood. I mean, he came from a completely immigrant background, and it was a real working-class family. To Andy, fame was like royalty is to the Europeans or the South Americans. They're very big on royalty. And that was his social climbing, fame. He was really completely intoxicated with the idea of fame, famous people, anybody who was famous. He never turned down an invitation or an interview, ever. He would give an interview to the dog if it could talk.
What was the last exciting thing that happened to you?
We would say, oh, Andy, why do you have this creep around? Well, this person is useless or hopeless, or, oh, no, they're fascinating, Bob. I mean, maybe they think you're useless, I mean, it was, and I think that's more Catholic than just Christian, because there is this tradition in Catholicism of not judging, which is different, let's say, than Southern Baptist or Calvinist.
He called me up, and he said, oh, Dee, I just painted 50 portraits. I said, who the hell did you paint? He said, 50 German industrialists and businessmen. I said, that's terrible, Andy. How much did you get? He said, 50,000 each. Unless they had a wife or a child, in that case, 75,000. So, you do the quick arithmetic. It's a lot of bread. And it was done in 2 months, and it was done with a Polaroid. Those he never controlled. He took the Polaroid, he gave it to the boys in the on Broadway. They took it to the house that made the blow up, and they put the paint on, and then he would look at it. He would okay it. He'd say, no, the paint's wrong, do this. But he wasn't involved in it at all.
It's my own feeling that every artist, has peaks and valleys, right, and slumps, and you're hot for X amount of years, 15 minutes or whatever, and then you have to think of something to do to pay the rent. And Andy was, I think, what I think was most brilliant about Andy, really, was that he devised a way to pay the rent.
I'm a commercial person.
Why?
Well, I've got a lot of mouths to feed. Got to bring home the bacon.
Listen, Andy, really, listen. We gotta make the bread and butter. Who's gonna bring home the bacon? How are we going to pay the rent here? I mean, that was the reason for the portraits.
And I always used to say to Andy, you should charge people for the portrait and then add another fee for plastic surgery. Because, as you can see from my portrait, they're very, very flattering. And Andy didn't like me in glasses, so there were no glasses, and then he would make the nose straighter and snip out the double chin. And
there'd always be X amount of portraits to do, and that was like work. And then when we were in the think tank together, he would say, but what could we do for art? What kind of art could we do? Andy never really talked very much about art. He did it, he was a doer. And so he would say, oh, Ronnie, what's new? Do you have any ideas? Oh, I can't think of anything this week. Well, everybody sort of wants to be what they're not. He wanted to be an abstract artist. It was always in the back of his mind, and he would always try and think of how he could be abstract. He always liked the shadows in his paintings. He had gone to Paris, and Andy always went antiquing, and he found a beautiful skull, and he bought it, and he came back from Paris, and he handed it to me, and he said, take some photographs of this. Let's do some skull paintings. When I photographed it, what happened was the shadow that it cast made the head of a baby. It became a very interesting painting.
Aka, Midori, Ao, Gunjoiro, Kirdei.
Always seeking greater celebrity, in the 80s Warhol began experimenting with one of his greatest loves, television.
But I think, with the MTV show, we did 5 shows all together with him. Our ratings were up every show, and there was a direction going there. And he was getting better and better on camera as the host, the main host, and Jerry Hall and Debbie Harry and people like that working with. He was really behind it, and he financed all the TV shows, none of which at this point have made any money for him. But he believed in it, and we did 3 little 60-second spots for Saturday Night Live. Every year they had asked Andy to do it, to be the host.
And in the first place, I never thought I'd ever be on Saturday Night Live because I hate the show. And I never watched it. I never thought it was that great. And then if you're home on a Saturday night, why are you home on a Saturday night?
Yeah, really, we're waiting for you.
In the 80s, Warhol seemed to rediscover the youth culture that he'd been in love with 20 years earlier. The original factory had always been a hangout for musicians, and it was there that Warhol had discovered and produced the legendary Velvet Underground. Throughout the years, rock stars continued to come to Warhol's studio, attracted by his celebrity and his enthusiasm for their projects. But in the 80s, Warhol became actively involved with music again when he began producing pop videos.
The Curiosity Kids, Andy liked a lot. He came back from London and said, listen, the manager's going to call you up, let's do the tape. I don't care how little the budget will be, let's just do it.
Crazy sheep, you want the odd one out. Crazy sheep, let them know what you're all about. This is free cats on the street. Well, I can see sorrow in your eyes. How high can you go? There'll be a ride for every kind. You'll see.
The 80s for Andy, I believe, was recapturing of his youth of the 60s, because the 80s, the first part of the 80s became very much like the 60s, and there was various artists like myself and John Michel and Keith Haring who had sort of stirred that up again, and Andy was very lively about that. I remember him saying, "Oh my God, this is like the 60s again, this is fun." There were more art became the rock and roll of the 80s.
Andy Warhol is a scream, hang him on your wall.
So openings were really glamorous and fun, and people went there to fall in love and to look at art and to meet each other. It was the basic social hub.
He didn't go out there and start, walking to galleries and say, boy, I want to start talking to these young artists. They kind of came to him. With Jean-Michel Basquiat, they started painting together, and Clemente came in on a project. So it was Clemente and Jean-Michel, and Andy painting, and then just Jean-Michel and Andy. And that was a very kind of creative period for Andy because he got back to the brush. He did a number of paintings with Jean-Michel, which became a show. They had something really going there where they would paint at different times. They'd put the paintings up on the wall He would paint, and then Jean-Michel would come in later and start painting on top of that.
John Russell said that Andy was the greatest colorist since Matisse, and that he was in particular the great colorist of acrylic painting. And that on the surface, his colors seemed neon, lavender and pink and orange and green, bright green, but there was always black in every color. And it was true. Underneath it all, there's blackness. Andy was very aware of death all the time.
The feel of the show is so deathly. I mean, there's always been death in his work, suicides, disasters, and so on. But this has a terrible melancholy about it. I mean, a feeling of introspection, of looking backwards. And the one thing I kept thinking about was the relationship of this to, well, the great late self-portraits, people like, one doesn't dare say it, Rembrandt, Van Gogh, as we pronounce them in the States, a kind of moodiness, a kind of inwardness, a kind of darkness, a kind of loneliness, and this is a whole new world for Andy, and it suddenly clicks into place with a whole history of tragic late self-portraiture.
Andy Warhol died in hospital the day after a gallbladder operation. He was 58. At the time of his death, he lived alone in the house he'd once shared with his mother.
I heard about his death because his doctor called me, about 6:30, 6:45 in the morning that Sunday. And I was told, which was a, major surprise, to say the least. Because when I saw him Saturday afternoon in the hospital, he was fine.
Oh, yes, I'm the great pretender. Just like spinning girl, like a clown. I seem to be what I'm not used to. I'm wearing my heart like a crown, pretending that you're still around.
The souls of the just are in the hand of God, and no torment shall touch them. They seemed, in the view of the foolish, to be dead, and their passing away was thought an affliction, and their going forth from us utter destruction. But they are in peace.
I think everything has a beginning and everything has an end. And just like we're all sitting here right now, this kind of thing can't keep going on about Andy because now it's really finished.
Well, the future of Andy Warhol Studio is that right now we're the estate of Andy Warhol, which is so odd sounding, and we're in transition to become a foundation for the visual arts. Through Andy's name, even though he's not with us anymore, he'll be able to help people through giving money away every year. So it's kind of that, in a sense, is very positive.
He encouraged us very much to see our lives as movies and to star in them and to direct them, i.e., take control of your life.
How long have you been working here now?
Well, I started here in February.
Now the Tower of the Warden, Hume Kroon. And you got 18 men, prison guards. Actually, I didn't like, and good night. That's it.